Okay, so it's 4:31. Let me reset my clock here so I can make sure I have my timings correct. And I'm painfully aware that I'm in between you guys and beer. So we're going to go through and we're going to talk about a topic called Get IAM Right. Kind of the backstory behind this is, if you've been down to how many people have been down to our booth and gotten fidget spinners? A couple of you, great. That sounds good. The whole idea behind this topic is we wanted to, we've had a couple of people come down and say, this is your tagline. It says Get IAM Right. What does getting IAM Right even mean? And so the purpose of this session is to try to put a little bit of color around it. It's not a super technical session, so I'll advertise that in advance. But we're going to bring up some issues that we're seeing in the marketplace, and we're going to talk through a couple different things and how we think we can bring some solutions to bear and how we can address some stuff. My color man, Joe Campbell, is going to join me. You better have a microphone.
I got a microphone. I'm ready to
Awesome. Go. Okay, good. So I'm going to look to Joe to keep me honest, and we'll go through there. But before I begin, how many people in the room have been in the room for one of the earlier sessions? Great. So you're going to get some repeated content, which is always fun. So I'm feeling the need to kind of bring this piece up early on, simply because we've had a bunch of people come up to us and said, "Who are you guys and what do you do?" Which I've had to do a couple of times in the past couple of years, but Joe puts it really well. He says, "You think you don't know us, but you know us." So One Identity is a company that began kind of a couple of years ago as Quest Software. So you may have heard of Quest. You're probably familiar with products like Toad and Active Roles and kind of some of the things we had there, Change Auditor, Identity Manager, a few of those things. And about 4 years ago, we got acquired by Dell and became part of it. It became kind of the core of the Dell software group. And about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I guess, Michael Dell decided he didn't really like the software business and wanted to get into the hardware business and bought a small company called EMC and did a tiny little merger to bring the two companies together. And one of the things that they decided to do was get out of the software business. And so Quest Software got sold, or One Identity, the Dell software group got sold off and became kind of a couple of different companies. The two key ones are Quest Software. And for us, most recently, Quest Software, One Identity kind of pulled out of Quest Software and became our own kind of legal entity as a Quest Software business. So that's kind of who we are. That's sort of where we've come from. So it's good to be kind of our own heritage again, and it's interesting to. I feel like we've gotten a lot more name recognition in just the short time that we've been kind of separated than we did kind of earlier. So
yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, it seems like every time we turn around and we tell someone, well, Quest Software, they go, "Oh, yeah, you guys." So.
Cool. So that's who we are. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, I've had I've had a bunch of people come down to the booth, and they say, your tagline is Get IAM Right. Like, what does that even mean? And so what we're going to go through for the next few minutes together is to kind of talk about what we mean by Get IAM Right, where we think folks aren't getting IAM right, and some of the things we can do to kind of address some of that. So I start with a really kind of basic slide. This isn't complicated. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of kind of moving pieces, but at the end of the day, it boils down to a really, really simple concept, and it's really, really the easiest way to think of it is it's just really basic. It's that the people who are accessing your systems are able to do so without any kind of friction, and that they've got the entitlements that they need in order to do their job, compliant with the regulations that are impacting your business, and compliant with the risk tolerance that your business has accepted or has adopted. You're going to hear me talk a lot, and if you sat in kind of one of the earlier talks, you'll know that kind of one of my passions is kind of this alignment between business and IT. And so we're going to talk a lot about the business and the business and the business, and that's a kind of a critical piece and component of this. But at the end of the day, this isn't really complicated. This is really kind of what it boils down to. Now, this is a really, really simple concept. It's really hard to do in the enterprise. And so we'll talk about kind of why that is and where we think we can go wrong. So you've said a couple times, George, this is really, if we're going to be trying to get IAM right, why do we keep doing it wrong? Or what have we done that's led us to getting IAM wrong? There's a bunch of reasons. Legacy systems is a first and kind of easy one. Joe opened his thing talking about federation and why isn't federation good enough? Real easy answer. Legacy systems is probably the quickest answer there. They're a drain on our technology. They're a drain on our resources. We'll now cut to my talk, right? Lack of business attention. And that's a double-edged sword, right? Part of that is that the business is working and doing their own thing, and they don't really care about kind of our problems. But we also haven't done a great job as professionals of keeping them in the loop and providing information in a meaningful way from their stuff.
Something you said a second ago.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want this much color. By the way, the guy in the front is talking. Hey, I'm just a developer, and I prefer to sit.
I do like color.
But something you said in your last talk, George, we've all heard, guys, about keeping the business agile, what's the transformation of IT, all this kind of stuff.
IT transformation.
One of the things George said in your last, I haven't said it before, but now I'm going to write an article about it and steal what you said. But it was like, how come we haven't seen RFPs asking for, will your solution keep our business agile? What do you do to keep, put the control into the business number? All the RFPs we see are, again, can this byte talk to that bit and whatnot? But sorry to interrupt you, but when you talk about lack of business attention, I think it's fascinating that in so many RFPs we go into, there aren't questions given to us about how we make sure that the business stays agile.
Yeah, it's something I started thinking about a few months ago, but it's fascinating, right? Because as a vendor, we get these things and we go and we look at them, and we're first of all, we all think we're speaking the same language, and I know you guys, I'm sure you guys have all kind of written RFPs or worked and prepared them, and they are perfectly clear in the way in your minds, right? And we look at the things and we go, what the fuck? Like, what does this even mean? So you're trying to go back and forth, but yeah, I mean, it's rare that you get very specific questions, but rarely do you get substantive questions. So, just a thought. Silos, patchworks. This has all been kind of traditional as we go through. Business people are trying to solve this little problem, and so they get this little widget that solves this little problem. But they don't. I used to joke that I knew a guy who worked for a big bank who was the project manager for left-handed doorknobs. And it was like kind of like that's his focus, and that's what he's doing on, but it ignores kind of the broader component of things. And then, this iceberg effect. I have this visual of, people look at a system and they see this tiny little thing poking out of the water, and there's just all this drag underneath that's going to sink your ship and kill Leonardo DiCaprio and do all other kinds of terrible things to your business. But
is that terrible?
What's that? Is it terrible? I don't know.
I take it back. He's impressive.
On a note on that, yeah, I don't know. My first job when I came out of college was I worked for a bank on Wall Street, and every so often we'd have like a data center power down, and you'd go in there and there'd be like these servers that nobody knew what they did. Like, what does it do? I don't know. Can we turn it off? I don't know. So we shut them dutifully down and turned them on and didn't know whether they were working or not, or hoped that they came back up. And as long as you didn't get any calls, you assumed everything was okay. But like, that's a perfect example of this iceberg effect. There's just so much going on, and it's so complicated. The takeaway from this slide is, I want to kind of put this out here, is that the challenges that we're going to be talking about are real. There's real complexity associated with this. So you can kind of look at kind of some of these environments. Some of these make me very sad as a professional to look at this. 86% of users feel avoiding the security teams is the best policy. Like 86%. Like, that's terrible.
Yeah, we didn't make these things up.
Yeah, these are all sourced, right? So that's this classic. We call it the Department of No. Can we do that? No. But can I access social media even though my title is director of social media? No. It doesn't make any sense. Again, the average IAM initiative is going on for 6 years. And someday you'll deliver that value you were talking about. They kind of drag, because again, it's a hard thing to be able to do with. Really simple, right? The average enterprise end user has to access 27 applications and has a minimum of 6 enterprise-issued passwords. Like, this is just horrible. What are we doing to our end users? And then the worst problem here is that going forward, if you sat in the other talk, I mentioned that there were a couple of ways that we could get the focus on the business, and one of them was with regulation. Turns out the regulators have discovered this, and that's a very bad thing for all of us. Because going forward, there's going to be much higher penalties associated with a lot of this stuff. One of the quickest ways to ruin something is to let Congress get involved. The same thing is true with our European colleagues. How many are you guys familiar with GDPR? Probably anybody losing sleep over it? Maybe it's not your problem.
Sounds like a money-making venture.
Yeah. So, the penalties associated with this are incredible, right? For some of these breaches, like if you have a particular kind of breach, they just take 4% off the top. Like 4%, like that's a lot of money. Like that's a year's worth of profit for some companies. So it's a really, really big issue. My favorite quote on this one is, from the side here, it turns out that 5% of organizations feel that they're definitely in compliance. So
That's it?
5%. So that's pretty good, I guess. We know that there's lots more budgets coming down the pipe. We know it's a problem that everybody's kind of struggling dealing with, but everybody's just kind of putting their head in the sand and saying, we've still got these silos. How are we going to be able to address all this kind of stuff? But I've got some good news for you, and the good news is it's only getting worse. So provisioning, on average, it takes more than a day and a half to provision a new user and more than half a day to deprovision a user. That's actually a great story. There's a company that I used to work with up in New York. They're an insurance company, and they told me their average time to provision a user was 2.5 weeks. And that included like consultants they were bringing in and paying by the hour. So it's pretty horrible going on there. Yo.
We had a customer once, this has been a while ago, but we were bringing an authentication layer for these folks and doing some like fine-grained authorization and whatnot, and they said, we need you to authenticate our users against Active Directory. I said, okay, I got that. And they said, but we also need you to authenticate or basically fail over to a CSV file. All right, so basically what happened is their HR system would output a CSV file that would have a user ID and a password in it, right? Basically like some sort of a default password. But it took so long for them to get those things provisioned into Active Directory, but they needed the users to get access to the systems right away. So we literally built a custom application authentication layer that basically said, check Active Directory, and if they're not there, go look in the CSV file and try to authenticate them against that until it could get imported into HR. Why is that? Because it took long for them to provision.
That seems secure.
Yeah.
Seems legit.
I helped.
So it's pretty terrible is the point of the story going out there. And again, the good news is, or the bad news is, the pace is just accelerating. Again, I mentioned this in my talk earlier, is that the businesses are continuing and being forced to innovate at a faster and faster pace. We've got new ways we're interacting. It's not just employee or contractor. We've got federations, we've got partnerships, we've got vendors, we've got all kinds of interrelationships, and the pace is just accelerating. So we want to figure out how do we get it right. What happens if we don't get it right? So there's a couple of people up there who didn't get it right. It's really, really bad. And again, I mentioned we've got new folks in here. Anybody in here from Centrify? The vendor? No. I'm going to plug a competitor. They wrote a great study they did recently around security professionals and brand awareness or brand responsibility. And the net is that somewhere on the order of 15% of security professionals said that they felt like they were in some part responsible for their company's brand performance or brand reputation. I've got news. All of us as security professionals are going to be responsible for the company's brand. And again, the important point, the key takeaway here is that every one of the companies that we looked at here, or departments or organizations here, they all had mitigating things in place. Target, Joe, you do a great story around the Target breach and all the stuff that they had in place.
Yeah, I just thought of a new line for that. It's the firewall is dead. Long live the firewall.
Yeah.
I'm looking at this list. I mean, we do a lot of in-depth research on the stuff that happens in these situations. OPM, Target, they're all really super great examples of where. Let me back up a step. One of the things you just said, we're all security professionals. It's very, very common for people in identity and access management to belittle their role in the organization to one of like an HR lackey, or I just reset user IDs and passwords. The real security heroes are the firewall guys and the network guys. Those are the real security heroes. No. In every single one of these examples, all those layers of defense were put in place, and in every single one of those examples, they were completely irrelevant, because today's breachers are not the engineers of the past looking for zero-day exploits and whatnot. They're basically identity thieves. And what are our jobs? We're identity experts, right? So in every single one of these situations, yes, it's true that it might have helped to have multi-factor authentication, et cetera, but when you have the credentials, you're no longer a suspicious actor, right? In the Office of Personnel Management breach, a lot of people said, I can't believe they didn't have the database encrypted. That's ridiculous. It wouldn't have mattered, right? So even the State Department said it wouldn't have mattered because the people that accessed the Office of Personnel Management database had adequate credentials to get in, right? So it's not about the firewall. It's not about the application architectures that are put in place to make sure this doesn't happen. It's about the people in this room, right? We need to make sure that we augment those traditional layers of defense with identity and depth, right? It's not just defense and depth, it's identity and depth. So, not that I'm passionate about it or anything.
It sounds like a good topic for a talk. Yeah.
Yeah. We're security folks. That's what we are.
So what does right look like, right? So, and again, I sort of touched on this again, but I'll re-emphasize it, right? So the right people, whether they're employees, administrators, partners, customers, friends, associates, whomever, they have the right access. They have exactly what they need to do their job, no more, no less. They have access to the right resources, on-prem, off-prem, in the cloud, on a device, wherever, in the way they want, right? On the firewall, on the network, off the network, remotely, on your cell phone, even if it's a Windows phone, on your tablet, kind of whatever we go. At the right time, right? During regular work hours, anytime anybody needs that access, responsive, with the right governance. And governance is a key kind of concept here. I talk about governance is just meaning that they're compliant with the risk tolerance that the business is willing to accept. A lot of people think about governance, I talked about this earlier, so if you were here earlier, I apologize because it's going to be a little redundant, but a lot of people think about governance as being able to say, I complied with a policy. But at the end of the day, the policy is only relevant in that it enforces the risk profile that the business is willing to adopt. And so it's important to think that there's a distinction between governance as a process and governance as an outcome. And finally, the last kind of piece of this thing is, and that you're able to prove it. Because we know that the regulators are coming down the pipe. We know that they're going to be forcing this kind of stuff down. We've seen it, and so we're going to need to be able to prove that we're compliant with kind of all these things. So when you get it right, the right people are in control. You achieve the outcomes that drove the program in the first place. This is kind of a tangent, but I'll throw it in here. It breaks my heart when we sit down with customers and we say, we implemented this platform and we had all these ideas and we had all these high hopes and we just didn't get anywhere. That drives me bananas. When we get it right, the business is happy because they got the value that they were expecting to get as a result of the problem. Security is considered an ally, not an enemy. Joe did a great talk on this earlier. If you didn't get a chance to watch it, I highly recommend you catch the video. But it's sort of, the security isn't the group of security bullies who are picking on the business and saying, no, you can't do that, no, you can't have that, no, you can't get your job done. But on the flip side, they're not the elephant in the room that everybody's ignored. When you get it right, security is an ally and is helping with the organizational success. Your IAM program covers all your needs today and paves the way to future success. If your existing IAM program is not anticipating the cloud and how you're going to support the cloud in an incredibly rich way, the same way with all of the features and fidelity that you get with your on-prem solutions, but is able to respond in the way you deal with cloud applications or SaaS, literally swipe the credit card, turn it on, we're good to go. You need to probably think about and spend some time on how you're doing your identity and access management platform. IAM transitions from a barrier or an obstruction to enabler. It's able to generate top-line revenue. One of my favoritist, that's a word, projects that I got to work with was with a company that I can't say who they are because I don't think they were allowed to do that, but they essentially do outsourced drug trials for large pharma manufacturers, right? So you're Merck or any of the big drug manufacturers, and you need to do a certain set of testing. Merck will outsource their kind of end testing to this customer, and they go and they do their testing, and they send the results back. And it needs to be really collaborative, right? Because you're talking about you're talking about two different organizations, so you have that piece there, but there's a ton of different roles kind of within that organization. You've got physicians and clinicians and scientists, and they all have different access parameters. And they all have different requirements, and they have to do things differently, and people come in and they move out, and we have to be able to work in a really responsive fashion. And we were able to build a really innovative solution with them, with self-service and all those kinds of stuff. And it was one of my favorite projects that I've worked with since coming to One Identity, simply because it was really focused on the top line. It wasn't, kind of the IT work of, how do we get the account from here to here, but it was really about how do we take that capability and move it from being something that's defensive from an organization into something that's offensive for an organization. And those are the kinds of things that as security professionals we're going to be called on to do more and more kind of going forward. So if these are the things that we can do when we get it right, the question becomes, what's stopping us? Why haven't we been able to get it done so far? These are some numbers that came from Gartner. This I think is a shocking one. 63% of the organizations that they surveyed are going to be replacing one or more IAM technologies in the next 2 years. And the question, the next question then is, okay, why? Why would we do that? Well, really simple. The technology environment has changed, and the incumbent solution doesn't address our requirements. So lots of folks have been making decisions or have made decisions in the past. They were probably good decisions when they were made, but we're changing the IT environment, and we're doing it rapidly. And so we're going to have to do some work going forward to try to get things right. Second big one, 58% of organizations are embracing the cloud. This tells me that 42% are coming kicking and screaming. Interestingly enough, only 58% of organizations are embracing the cloud, but 93% are storing sensitive data in the cloud. Date. That's a typo. That shouldn't be date. That should be data.
No, they store dates in the cloud.
They store dates. That'll work. That'll work. 44% growth in spending for the cloud over the next 2 years. Lots and lots of solutions that we've adopted over the past 2 years just aren't really cloud ready. They're focused on IAM is a perfect example of where historically traditional IAM platforms haven't done a great job in the cloud. And I talked about why in my last session, but it's going to have to be things that we're going to have to think about it. Is it hybrid cloud ready? Through 2020, 95% of IDaaS security failures will be the customer's fault, and more than half of those will be attributed to inadequate management of identities and privileges. That's bad. More than half. So we're saying that half of the failures are going to be essentially because your IAM platform didn't do what it needed to do. That's something we're going to have to focus on as an industry going forward. What are some of the barriers? Okay, so some of the barriers are kind of obvious. First is complexity and reliance on customization. I get this question a lot as I go to plan for things. We have a set of out-of-the-box platforms that we support. Customers will come and say, well, what about my whiz-bang doohickey platform? Do you have a way to connect to that? John, what's the answer that we usually give when we say that? Yes, and why? How can we do it? With a custom connector. We'll build you a custom connector. That's great, and we're still going to need to be able to do that for certain applications, but we're also going to have additional ways to address it. We're going to have to build into the platform the ability to talk to a variety of things without having to rely on that constant customization. Constant change. I mentioned this earlier. I had a customer who I was talking with last week, and we said to them, well, what platforms are you planning to bring in? What changes are going to be in your security environment in the next, say, year, 2 years? And they told me none. Okay. Pretty sure that's not going to happen, but whatever. No, we're having constant change, and some of it's like that iceberg, right? Maybe some of it's happening up above the water, but there's a ton of it happening below the water. And we have to be able to prepare for that and go through that. Limitations of legacy technology and existing skill sets. I had a slide in here that I cut out because I felt like I had a lot of statistics slides. But the one that we cut out said that, I forget the number, Joe. Was it 45% or something? It was the one of the number one reasons for why people face problems in their identity environment was lack of skill set. It was lack of skill set. It's a big issue. We're not going to be able to grow the level of security professional that we need in order to manage these environments going forward. So there's two ways we can address that. The first is we can take the simple things that people are doing, the manual processes, the manual kind of interventions, all of the kind of the cruft work that our security professionals are doing, and automate that to free them up to do the valuable stuff. The other thing we can do is we can start to take some of the stuff that some of the knowledge that exists in those infrastructures and build it into the platform. So between smarter platforms and more automated platforms, we'll be able to address some of that. Security silos. I could flip back to my to the thing we were just looking at on the breaches. Every one of those environments had a siloed set of security. The firewall didn't know what the application was doing. The application didn't know what the identity system was doing. And attackers have gotten sophisticated, and they're good at picking these things apart. It's not so much that they're smart hackers that they're able to do these kinds of things, but they're persistent and they're thorough, and there's a lot of them. And so they can pick those holes apart in a hurry. You look like you had something you wanted to interject.
Yeah. Silos sometimes are just fine. The critical flaw is when you don't have good communication. And I was in an environment last week, I won't mention exactly who that was at all, but it was really I don't know if you guys remember the Inspector Clouseau scene where he checks into a hotel and there's the dog there and he says, does your dog bite, right? Yeah. And the guy goes, no. So he reaches down to pet the dog and it bites him and he says, I thought you said your dog didn't bite. And he goes, that's not my dog. That literally happened to me 2 weeks ago, I think. So we're in these meetings and there is such an obvious silo between these organizations, and we're addressing these problems and talking about what we're trying to do, and literally the entire time there's a person in the room that had critical information that he needed to share, could have shared, that would have saved us a lot of effort. So next thing you know, we're in the next phase of the project and we're working on something and we're showing this person how to do something, and he's clicking through and he's like, well, you can't do this because of so-and-so. I'm like, how do you know that? Well, because this is what killed us last time. And I'm like, we're literally sitting in a planning meeting 5 minutes ago, and you're not saying this. And I can tell you 100% that the reason why was a cultural issue. I'm in this room. I'm not going to speak. I think this is obvious to all of us, but someone needs to address this if this is happening in your organization. Someone needs to go to the top and say, look, we need to work on our culture a little bit, because this culture is going to get us all bit, right? Because we're going to ask to pet the dog, and they're saying, yeah, go ahead, even though they know that we shouldn't do this. And it literally happened to me last week, 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, two more, and then we'll move on. But I think addressing the challenge du jour is a one-off. This is back to the left-handed doorknob guy, right? We look at a security problem, and we say, I'm going to fix this widget that's going to solve this one problem, and failing to consider kind of how that's going to adapt into the broader kind of environment. And then lack of integration, flexibility, and foresight. I'm a little cynical, I think is the word, in that those are kind of organizational challenges that you mentioned, Joe, are going to exist, and they probably, I'm sure they don't exist in any of your organizations, but they've existed in every organization that I've worked for. So I'll leave it at that. And I think that as a software vendor, what we can do as vendors is we can ensure maximum flexibility, and we can avoid painting you into corners. So as we propose solutions, as we build things, we want to minimize the number of irreversible decision making or irreversible corners that you're turning, so that, and typically that's what we've tried to focus on, is that no matter where you want to start, no matter what you need to do, we can say, okay, start where you need to, and adapt and overcome.
There's one more thing I'll add.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a tangent, because not that we rehearse this at all. Knowing George and I, that's actually not true. We don't rehearse anything, but that limitations of legacy technology and existing skill sets. One of the things that I get reminded of there is making sure that your IAM solution is using industry standard specifications, things like SCIM and whatnot, LDAP, SAML, whatever the technology is. there are too many IAM solutions out there that are basically using proprietary communication layers and whatnot. And it's kind of like, if you don't do this way, then it's not going to work. So your application layer needs to have our custom connector put in, and this has to be. Well, what happens now is that when you go to the industry and you say, look, I need to replace this guy's role or this lady's role with someone who knows this, your pool of people you can choose from that come in and can help you is dramatically limited by the fact that you're using a proprietary IAM technology. It's just like when you're coding in something like one of my all-time favorite languages, Borland's Pascal. The simple fact is it's easier to hire a Java developer or a .NET developer than it is a Delphi developer these days. Even though the Delphi developers are awesome. But the point is that make sure our IAM solution is not using a skill that's proprietary to that particular platform. You want people that are using a platform that uses open technology and open standards, just like ours.
Yeah. All right. So we've talked about the problem. How do we get it right? How do we get to successful outcomes? So this is going to be more of kind of a process kind of conversation than so much a technology problem. I think it begins with strategy and vision, and I've talked about this a bunch. It's incumbent upon us as security professionals that when we think about our strategy, we think about our vision, that we're complete. And what I mean by that is we have our technical silo, but as we're considering the solutions that we're bringing into our environments, it's kind of really important that I think we're a little humble and that we really think about things through from the perspective of our end users. This is so critical because we've talked about shadow IT and we think about all those kinds of things. And I grew up kind of on the technology side of the house. And so I can remember coming out my first job, and I came and I worked on Wall Street, and we would put something in place and the business wouldn't adopt it, or we'd have trouble with them. We would just say, well, they're stupid. They don't know what they're doing or whatever. And it took me a long time to kind of realize that, one, I wasn't a revenue generating unit, and so I needed a little bit of humility there. But two, that really they're dealing with real problems and real concrete things, and the pressure that exists on these kinds of organizations is enormous, and they have to be flexible. In a lot of cases, it's not that they don't want to go around IT, they don't want to go around security. They have to go around security because the alternative is going out of business and losing ground to competitors. And so it's something that we have to think about. So I guess you want your vision and your strategy to be complete. Be humble and think about it from the perspective of your business users. No technical plan would be complete without technology, and technology is really, really important. There's a specific reason why I chose it as the second bullet and not the first bullet. I see this getting it wrong a lot from customers. They spend an awful lot of time thinking about the technology, and that they spend an awful lot of effort, on technology selection. We're going to go and we're going to do a 6-week proof of concept, and we're going to test out every possible use case, and we're going to grind it into the universe, and we're going to pick the technology that goes through there. I'm going to let everybody in on a dirty little secret. Make sure there's no salespeople in the room. There's a lot of vendors down on the vendor floor. I know lots of those guys. I've worked with them a lot. All those solutions work. You're not going to find anybody down there who's selling something that doesn't work. Some are more flexible than others, some are more powerful than others, but they all work. The technology selection is an important thing, but it's not the only thing, and that's something to think about kind of going forward. Internal staff and skills. This is relevant for a couple things. One is that you need to kind of think about, as you're looking at your strategy and your technology, you need to look at your internal folks and what is their skill set, what are the things that they need to have and need to be aware of. There's an enormous pitfall here, and I see tons of customers falling into this pit. And it's the idea that we're going to take a project, and it's going to be a finite period of length, and then it is going to end. So we're going to take an IAM solution, we're going to deploy the IAM project, and it's going to last X number of months, and then at the end of it, it's going to stop. Everything that you're going to deploy in your infrastructure, you're going to continue to live with for the foreseeable future. It's critical that you understand how it works, how it's going to play in, and if people need to have their skills uplifted, they have to be trained, they have to go through, it's critical that you do that. So many projects that I see that go south because we get to the last 6 weeks of the project and the implementer is rolling off, and it's about that point where people realize they're going to be gone in 6 months, and I have no idea how this thing works. It's not a best practice in order to do that. So as you're going through, you think about not just what the staff needs to be. How am I going to maintain this? Who's going to be the champion who's going to continue to take this over once the project ends and the temporary help roll off? Joe, you look like
Yeah,
you have
I'll add a bit of a building on that point. There's an identity project we're working on with a really large city in California, and on the project we have partners that have come in. They're implementing the identity project, and we're getting to the point now where it's about literally as we speak, it's rolling out to the help desk and the Active Directory or Active Directory managers and whatnot and the staff. What we did is we came in and we said, look, one of the things you need to do is evangelize this correctly to the people that are going to be using it. And quite honestly, I flat out said to them, I said, our integrator and your engineers that have helped us build this project are not the right people to do that. I said, bring in myself, my colleague Wayne Smiley. I said, let us come in and meet with you guys and we'll evangelize to the business. And so we set up a series of meetings, first with the who those folks work for, so the executive staff to get executive buy-in and whatnot, because they basically, really they didn't have too much to do with the whole project itself. And we explained it to them first, hey, this is what you're going to do, there's going to be some growing pains. And then we actually met with the people that are pulling the triggers, so to speak, and said, look, let us explain to you the philosophy behind this, what we're trying to do and whatnot. And that's a big deal too. So it's not necessarily exactly what you were saying, but when we're doing identity projects, we have to think beyond the fact that we're just going to simply deploy this on our users without having evangelized the importance of what we're trying to do. And have someone, quite honestly, not that we're that awesome, but have someone like us that does that, not an engineer that, like myself, I'm not the best at it, and explaining things in bits and bytes. You need someone to give a bigger picture and walk the users through the purpose of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, they're a public case study, so I can talk about them. A customer, one of our customers is Sky in BSkyB in Europe, and one of the things I thought was really cool is as they were getting ready to deploy the identity management solution, they were putting out flyers that they wanted people to give them, hey, this is coming, we want you to be aware of it, and they wanted to put it someplace where nobody could miss it. And so they went and put it on the back of the doors in the toilets. Yeah. And it sounds kind of, but it was innovative, and it was kind of, they did a whole series of videos and they linked into it, and hey, this is coming, and it was a really good example, I thought, of that evangelism going forward. So, flexibility. As you're deploying your solutions, as you're coming up with their architectures, you have to allow for flexibility going forward. The most successful solutions that we've seen, it's funny, there's been an evolution, I would argue in the last 18 months or so, where folks have, and it's not perfectly accurate because it's an infrastructure project and not really a software development project, but first, years ago when I used to do this, people had a very waterfall kind of mentality. We're going to design the solution. We're going to spend 6 months, 8 months, 10 months up front. We're going to architect it, and the architecture is going to be perfect, and then we're going to go and implement it. And the problem is that the business changes in the 8 months between the time you started and the time you ended. And so the decisions that you made are not necessarily invalid, but maybe not so great. Last, I would say 18 months, a lot more people adopting a much more agile kind of framework. They're saying, you know what, this is the scope we're going to do for phase 1, this is going to be our phase 2. It's incumbent that you, from your perspective as project people, that you're understanding that you're going to have to be flexible from that perspective. Things are going to change, that's going to be okay. From us as a platform vendor, it's important that our platforms can support that level of flexibility. Again, I want to minimize the number of hard corners that you have to turn and how many forks in the road you have to come to. Deployment partners. We have adopted internally. We have our own professional services people. They're very, very good. But we have deeply been supporting or have made a strategic investment in moving to very professional, very talented deployment partners. A small number. We don't have 26,000 partners that we work with. We have a small number, like on the order of folks you can count on a hand. We know what they specialize in. We know what they're focused on, and they in turn invest in us. And so great example of this is we just project that Joe and I have been working on. We have just sort of opened up our internal communication channels to our partners and extended it via federation. So our deployment partners get to the exact same channels of communication that we do internally, whether it's to the developers, whether it's to the business units, whether it's to whomever. It's important that the folks you choose kind of are adopting kind of that methodology. And then finally, support. Like that's a critical component. And again, support from your vendor, support from your deployment partners, making sure that support internally, making sure that you have that kind of ongoing channel of communication going forward. Thoughts? Cool. I got one more slide, and then I'll let you go to the beer. So again, this is kind of the sort of the last sort of bastion here. These are the components that take it that takes to get IAM right. All the stuff I've already talked about, this is where we think we focus on as a vendor. This is what makes us different from the other guys that are kind of down there in the expo. I don't know what I'll highlight on here. Business driven, kind of the critical one. Hopefully you've gotten some of that passion. I don't think I'm the only one. Modular and integrated, that's a critical piece. We really want you guys to have the ability to start anywhere and be able to finish anywhere. Goes back to that flexibility that we talked about earlier. Future ready, again, if you've sat through a couple of these, you've heard some of that stuff. Focus on the cloud, focus on the stuff coming down the pipe, focus on standards that are coming down the pipe. And again, rapid time to value. We're not going to force you to go down this path of we're going to do an 8-month architecture before we begin doing kind of any deployment. We want to get quick wins. We want to go from there. And with that, I thought I had an ending. So no, I'm starting at the beginning. I don't want to do that. I'll leave it there. Cool. Any questions, comments, thoughts? All right. Well, Joe and I will be here. If not, I will no longer stand between you guys and the beer. I'll give you 5 minutes back in your calendar. Thank you so much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the show.